record to the cloud. Okay, let me say a few words before you start, if I can manage this computer. Good, 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 good. So this year, 2026, we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Stanford Research Park, which was the prototype of university research parks founded in 1951. Mihai Codreanu is an economist working on the long-term effects of innovation and in general technology. He has a PhD from Stanford, very recent, congratulations. And his dissertation is the topic of this talk. That dissertation has won multiple prizes, both inside and outside Stanford. And personally, I think the impact of his work will extend beyond the dissertation because the value, the data, we live in the age of data, and he did an amazing job at finding data that we didn't have before. So, podium is all yours. Go ahead, tell us the story.
Thank you so much for being here, and I'm honored that you thought about me. So, I saw the list of incredible guests that you have. So, it really represents a lot to me to be invited here today. Yeah, so I'm Mihai Codreanu. I just finished my PhD at Stanford University, and my work was on the impact of university research parks. So I gotta tell you like how this project actually started at the beginning. So I just came at Stanford and I was really interested in innovation and entrepreneurship. And particular as Piero just said, its effects in over the very long run. And I was interested in like AI. I was interested in the current technologies. But in second year, we had this compulsory economic history paper that we had to write. And I was like, why do I have to write this? I want to think about the future. I want to think about like the technologies of today and how they're going to affect labor market over the very long run. But then I realized that there's so many interesting stories about Silicon Valley that are not actually written, at least in a, quantitative way. And why is that? I discovered that like the main source of why there isn't more economics research, because there's been quite a lot of historical research that you'll hear about, in this very session. Um, there's no more economics research because there isn't that much quantitative data tracking firms over the 20th century, especially firms that are more like, non-public, smaller firms that are non-manufacturing. And why is that? Like, usually like people would track like with patents data, for example, like, these like big corporations and there would be census data. But again, census data, like it has some issues around like, it only starts being very reliable around the second part of the 20th century. And there were some size constraints. It would cover mostly like, with the census of manufacturers, the firms that are more into manufacturing. But I realized that like if you want to talk about the history of Silicon Valley and why Silicon Valley became what it is today, you want to data on like these like small firms, on firms that are, not the big corporations, but rather like, the beginning of those big corporations that are like, smaller firms. So I came across the history of Fred Terman at Stanford, and one of his initiatives, which was as you've heard, the Stanford Research Park. So you all know the story, like Stanford being land rich but cash poor, coming with the idea of having these like 99 years long leases or 50 years long leases. For companies they couldn't obviously coming up with this idea because they couldn't like just outright sell the land because that was part of the charter. So they would give this sort of land to firms that are like Varian Associates, the first tenant, Hewlett Packard. Those were not, I mean, obviously they become huge firms and they were not negligible firms at the time, but they weren't the corporations that like we think about today. So what I did is I created a data set of engineering engineers over more than 100 years of scientists, of products in the 20th century. And how I did that, I basically collaborated with historians For example, I went to the IEEE historical archives where I could see through the collaboration with historians there, the annual registers of people who were affiliated with the IEEE. And in those annual registers, you'd have the name of the person who is affiliated with IEEE, their employer, their address, and sometimes also their job title. So in that way, you could see the evolution of firms even before they become public, they become firms that would patent a lot, firms that you'd usually be able to have them in traditional economic data. So what I found was that by putting together all these data sources and combining them, of course, with data on public firms, data on patents that was already accessible. And obviously, I should not undersell how much work there has been in order to put this data together because as you'd imagine, going to the IEEE, it meant sometimes scanning pages one by one and then going through an algorithm that would extract from those all directories the names of the people, where they're working, harmonizing and cleaning that data set. It's been a lot of work. But yeah, basically, I put this data together, and what I found is that the firms that came very early on in the Stanford Research Park actually did quite much better, at least descriptively, after they came compared to a group of firms that very likely had actually the opportunity to come to the research park. So what is this control group? In economics, basically, the technique that I'm telling you about is called difference in differences. That you are looking at firms that are coming into the research park after they come into the research park compared to firms that are, a good control group with the same, basically, break into it can be the temporal break or them opening up new offices. So basically, I found this in the archives, and I should be very thankful here to the incredible team at the Stanford University archives that made all of this possible. And not just at the Stanford University archives, other team around the university that made me aware of this data and helped me access it. I found that Fred Terman actually had very detailed note cards from the firms that he was keeping track of in the 1950s and 1960s. Why is that? We suppose that one of the main reasons that was happening was because he was actually one of the um, main scientific advisors to this investment company, television electronics fund, or television shares management company as it was called before. And basically his job was to provide advice, scientific advice over what companies to sort of invest in. So he had all this set of incredible firms with notes of firms that he thought would be very promising, and he actually reached out to many of these companies. So then we could compare the firms that actually came into the research park versus companies that Fred Terman obviously either recommended or either kept track of, or even in the most restrictive regression, essentially firms that the fund actually ended up investing in. So it wasn't just a matter of just saying some firms are actually quite promising. It was also that they were putting their money where their mouth was. So anyway, we are quite happy with that. It seems like, quite a reasonable control group. And what we found is that the firms that came into the Stanford Research Park essentially patented more. They were more likely to hire engineers. They were more likely to produce new electronics products after they came into the research park. So that was quite interesting to us. It seemed that the Stanford Research Park made an impact on the firms that came in, at least at the very beginning of it. So now what we wanted to do in the second part of the paper was to really understand why, because we were quite surprised of this, just opening up an office, how could that just affect increased patents by quite quite a reasonable amount like 5, 10, 15 patents, depending exactly on what specifications we're using after they're coming into the research park. So what we looked at were like a few other mechanisms that he put together that were strengthening the relationship between Stanford and the companies into the research park and the other local companies. So basically, he was also a big proponent of the Honor Scope program. That was a program that essentially allowed students to take courses employees to be students and to take courses part-time while they're working full-time for companies, including companies into the Stanford Research Park. Also, there was like quite a bit of consultancy. We have some qualitative data on that, not the best data, but basically like professors from Stanford would actually be advising companies into the research park. There was basically a lot of transmission of knowledge from and like actual ties between the companies that were in the Stanford Research Park and company and the academic side. So there are like a lot of opportunities of knowledge transfer. Yeah, there's a bit more negative results. I would say in the last part of the paper in which we're looking essentially at like, can this generalize? Do the same results sort of like, hold today? Do we see any local impact on other university research parks? Or was this just like some sort of like, beginning of the Stanford Research Park? Fred Terman came up with this sensational idea. So, it seems that the results are definitely not as strong looking at other research parks. In the current time, especially like on like their local impact. And again, we suspect that a lot of it was like this like incredible circumstances that Fred Terman and vision of Fred Terman of like not just doing a research park, but also like increasing the actual ties with like actual programs between the companies in the research park and the academics in Stanford. So yeah, I mean, look, economics papers are very often like very strict on like the most like causally identified, the best control group. They love experiments. So this is not exactly that because we don't have like perfect data. But I think that was an incredible learning opportunity for us to go and collect new data and have opportunities to interact with people who are historians and learn more about Silicon Valley. So, I think that was an incredible opportunity, and I'm very glad that I get to tell you a little bit of this story to you today.
Yeah, so thank you first of all for doing the research because those data are really significant, and I'm sure people will go back to them. And now, of course, the challenge is that we should do the same research for other research parks. Somebody else should do it, and then you can really compare. So anyway,
Absolutely.
two questions. One you already touched on, so let's do the other one first. So it's pretty obvious, in my opinion, that Stanford, not only Fred Terman, had an influence on the startups. I mean, as you know, these startups were coming from Stanford, most of them. What about the other way around? Do you think that these startups at the Stanford Research Park influenced in a positive way the research going on at Stanford in the labs?
Yeah, so you're touching on a point that I really, really wanted to have in the paper. So we also digitized data on courseworks. So like basically like we had like the course register, like not the course descriptions of courses every year. And we were really interested in seeing if like concepts from patents actually like appear in the courses of of Stanford. So we do see that there is actually like descriptively there is some sort of correlation. It appears that these two like sort of move together. But it's very, very hard to know which direction, it's a bit of a chicken and egg. Is it like, the courses that are moving because of the patterns of the firms, or is it sort of the other way around? I mean, if I tell you my personal belief, I believe that, a simple model of science just moving from universities to like the private sector is incomplete. I much more believe in a symbiotic model in which is not just the universities that are transferring knowledge to the university to the firms, but rather also the other way around. So, but that's just my personal belief. I should say that I don't have like, the quantitative data at least to like show it, in a very decisive manner. But
Yeah, that's really the issue that we have a lot of stories. In a few seconds, I will tell you some of my opinions, but we don't have quantitative data, and so they remain opinions. Maybe this is true most of history, actually. So there are two theories when you have these research parks. One theory is that the research park is actually stealing talent from universities. Of course, in Silicon Valley, I mean, all these corporations, including you yourself, they're stealing students, the best students from the universities. The other theory is that the success of these companies encourages, motivates, inspires the students in the university. So, and here going again, we don't have quantitative data. And I personally think that both stories are true. What's your feeling also being one of the students, one of the people who have been stolen from academia?
I feel like these two go hand in hand. And I feel like, let's look at Stanford. I mean, I have some data in my paper. Again, like this is one anecdote. Like you don't make a paper just with anecdotes. But like, Stanford was not in the 1950s or the 1940s what it is today. So like, if you look at like the rankings of Stanford now, they're like, it's much better than it was, before Fred Terman, before the Stanford Research Park, before the Honors Cooperative program. So like, it seems that despite all these stealing of talent, the university is really performing better. And like, there's mechanisms to which that may happen. I'm already getting emails from the Alumni Association, asking for like my contacts. I have no doubts that I'm gonna be asked for like, donations. And like I Stanford really helped me become who I am today. So like,
Right.
yeah, why not invest in getting good education for students in the future? If I'm being asked to like give a little bit of a, I don't know, from the little that I know to give back to like the students of today, I'm going to be very happy to do that. So like, again, I think that this interaction between like, the private sector and academia is not that it can't be like described by just like, one simple framework in which like one actor just steals from the other. And if, there's like a symbiotic relationship in which perhaps both actors can win. So yeah, this is my personal opinion again.
No,
I
no,
should,
they're great,
yeah.
great, and especially coming from a former student. Of course, it would be nice to be able to talk to some of the people who were around in the 50s, but I guess not many are still around. Now, Now I tell you my theory. I wrote a book about this, and you're very welcome to disagree. Now I tell you this theory now because you will probably not be there in person to defend yourself when I come up with this theory. One of the very interesting parts of your thesis is when you start talking about does this generalize to other research parks? Again, we both have the same disclaimer. We don't have quantitative data on the other research parks. But instinct and just looking around, there's only one Silicon Valley. So uh, maybe China is the one that came closest. But anyway, it sounds like it does not generalize. So my opinion is that there was we tend uh, to underestimate the society. I'm from Europe. I think you're also from Europe, right? I
Yes.
mean, if you try to explain why Greece and then why Florence and so on, it's really difficult because if you lived 100 years before, you would never guess. And what was special was actually the society. They were not the richest, they were not the most powerful. Actually, Italy lost all the wars for 1,000 years, but there was something special about the society. And so now I come to the 1950s in the Bay Area. And one story of Silicon Valley starts with Fred Terman and the Stanford Research Park. But as you know, in parallel, you have William Shockley, 1956, and he opens his lab at the border between Mountain View and Palo Alto. And then from there, you have Fairchild and then you have Intel and so on. And that's a parallel story, right? And that's also very successful, right? So, in my opinion, you really have to look at another factor that complements all the great things that Thurman did. That is the society. It was a society that was ready to be creative. It was ready for this kind of new, almost impossible ideas, and other places weren't. So if you took Fred Thurman and you put it in Texas or in Florida or in London, probably you would not have had a Silicon Valley there. Now, your honest opinion, you don't have to agree with me. You're no longer a student. So,
Barely not a student. So yeah, I didn't have my commencement yet. So I didn't get my cap and everything. My diploma is not anywhere yet. But yeah, no, I mean, look, I think that it's very hard to say why clusters form, and it's just like because you have such a small sample issue, like that's how I'd call it in economics. Like, you have a few like high technology clusters, so like you can't really talk, like you can't really distinguish between a lot of factors. So like you didn't even mention, but there was like all the military spending in Silicon Valley as well.
DARPA.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was like, there were a bunch of other factors that may have happened. And I'm not here to tell you that like, Stanford Research Park is what, made Silicon Valley necessarily, or like I think it had a contribution. I think it was a welcome initiative. I think the firms that came into the research park, it seems like they did better after they came into the research park. I do think, by the way, that like the fact that William Shockley came to Stanford, if I'm not wrong, was actually because like like I think he was teaching at the university, and if I'm not wrong, actually he might have even had at some point an office in the research park before everybody decided that he was a bad boss. So like there is like a lot of interconnections. And I think it's hard to know exactly why things happened the way that they were. But, I think that reasonable people can have like, slightly different beliefs about why certain things happen. And, we should just hope that like people who are making policy into the future are going to be, um, are going to think carefully, and they're going to think carefully about like how they can actually like stimulate, and in what conditions these sort of like interactions between industry and academia sort of like happen, and when are they productive. And I think this is the story where I think we say something interesting that is just,
Right.
yeah.
And last question, as you immersed yourself in the 1950s, which is for you must be a very distant age, these dusty archives. And you probably had a feeling of how people were working before computers with typewriters and who knows. Um, and now today, look at Silicon Valley. It's not a cluster, it's a cluster of clusters. We have everything from silicon to software, AI, electric cars, you name it, right? Um, I mean, does it sound improbable, impossible that starting with that Stanford Research Park, then you end up with OpenAI and Tesla and Nvidia and Google and Facebook and so on? Or if you prefer, this is just now we're just guessing, huh? I mean, if Fred Thurman came back to life today, would it be shocked completely, or was there something already there that was so eclectic that went beyond just the technology of the time?
I think, what was there to some extent is like when he was talking about like why fund like why actually have the research park. He was complaining about all his great students actually going to the East Coast. So like he was saying that like basically he wants his best students to be able, like Hewlett and Packard, to have the chance to like build something in like Silicon Valley, well, what we now call Silicon Valley. What was like the Valley of Heart's Desire, or like beautiful agricultural land. uh so yeah, I mean, look, it's hard to know. I wish I had the ability to teleport to the 1950s. I think life would be, very different. It would be so interesting to have like this, like, communication of knowledge. I think, like one of the things that I would love to have this ability to like teleport would be to like just interview Fred Terman to ask him like, you know, how does he think about this research? Like, what that does he think like, it was yeah, does he think we're correct? What would he investigate? So, it's hard. It's hard. And I don't want to like oversell. I think a lot of the contribution of the paper is just to like, bring this like historical angle, an economic angle of like, building data quantitatively. Together. So, I had a lot of fun. Like, I meeting you, it was like it's amazing. I worked with people at IEEE, like, Marianne Hellriegel, like Alex Magud, like I would have like, there's a lot of people in the acknowledgements and that I didn't even put in the acknowledgements, but there will be in the papers like that like were so like influential. And like that's my best hope to like ask the historians who actually know much better, like if they think, this makes sense. But yeah, I mean, I had a lot of fun. I think this is a topic that needs more investigation. And I am a big fan of people who like, put their lives and, work on like topics like this that seem to me very high value for society.
Great. And we're all looking forward to what you will contribute in a few more years. Maybe you'll come back, or maybe you'll find a new angle and produce some new interesting report.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your time and for your work, and all the best for the future of your career.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.